This is Akhilesh Dhawan at A10 Networks. And I have Jamison with me. We're going to talk about the need for API protection. And I think this is an amazing topic and something that has gained a lot of traction recently as we are seeing surge in AI-driven applications and agents that has expanded the API attack surface. And with the growth of AI and AI in these applications, we expect, and Gartner expects, this to grow over 30%, where we will see the increase in demand for APIs, primarily from AI and tools using LLMs. Um, and then obviously, we have a lot of SaaS deployments, and we are seeing a surge in APIs as some of these third-party endpoints are requiring some broad privileges to help communicate across with application to application communication. So, the Jameson, let's talk a little bit about the APIs. Why are we seeing? You have been having a lot of customer conversations around security and the need to protect from all these different threats targeting APIs. Why is it getting so much importance these days?
Well, I think one of the reasons, Akhilesh, is diversity.
Yeah,
When we look at traditional web applications, we're mostly talking about HTTP style traffic, and sometimes JSON XML. But APIs, there are, just as the statistic posted, most enterprises have 15,000 or more happening in their enterprise.
yeah.
Well, each one of them has its own unique characteristics, its own unique problems. Many of the APIs that are implemented are either vendor driven, so
Hmm.
that's the API to interact with that product only, eh, or they're bespoke, meaning my developers created this API for how to interact with our product. And all of that leads to a lot of security loopholes and missed functions and things like that. Like it's everybody's trying to sort of create the wheel themselves, and
Hmm.
so each
Yeah,
API has to be dealt with almost uniquely.
it's always the developers, isn't it?
First you blame the network, then you blame the developers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you remember in the past, I think we used to talk a lot about shadow IT, right? And
Hmm.
people who are spinning up their own SaaS environments and pumping data and sharing data using collaboration tools or different email addresses, or any of their accounts where they have stored corporate information with IT has no knowledge. And I think that's something what you saying is similarly happening in the API world. Like, if customers buy products, SaaS, or web based even, and some organization thinks that they need to have better productivity, or they need to just design a new workflow, and they create some APIs without IT's governance. And I think that's a big deal in the shadow world, right? The shadow and the zombie APIs. Let's talk a little
Yeah,
bit about that.
yeah. Let's go shadow first.
Okay.
A consideration that I think a lot of people don't have is today it's normal for our offices to be full of IoT devices, whether they're badge readers or Zoom boxes or conferencing equipment of whatever kind you like. All of that IoT is driven by APIs, and they're often north-south APIs, right? They're
Yeah.
going to the web because Zoom conferencing actually happens in the cloud, right? Um, and so I think that's the first place people don't really think about, um, that they're adding APIs every time they add some new automated thing to their
Yeah.
network. Even printers, right? They're working on APIs with the cloud. And then the zombie is even more interesting, I think, as a former pen tester. Zombie APIs are those that are still available that are maybe not in use, and
Yeah.
so they can be really, really tricky because they're difficult to discover. First of all, if nobody's talking to them, they're
Mhm.
just there waiting. But those are the ones that become prime attack targets because no one's been watching this because they think it's dead, no longer available, etc. So I think those two are really kind of the boogeymen of the API world. I think it's
Yeah.
obvious for us to look at. our website or our phone apps or those things and say we know APIs are happening there, but we don't always think about the room temperature sensor.
Yeah, that is true. And and there are some compliance and regulations around the use of APIs and implementing some of these APIs in the environment. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think first I would say that the problem we have with any kind of compliance or regulation around it is there's no standards for APIs.
Yeah,
There's not a right. There's not a consortium that's pulled together. This is how APIs should function, or anything like that. And that makes it really, really difficult to actually properly regulate. Uh, and then also, as we just talked about with shadow and zombie APIs, the first way to properly regulate and or control any kind of protocol is to know it's there, to discover it,
yeah,
right? And so I think it's a pretty serious challenge to try to figure out how to govern them properly.
that is true. And I think lack of governance just is people, environments in enterprises, they are just implementing them without thinking about implications that it may have on not only from the compliance standards, but just on their own environment, and what kind of losses and you know damage that they can cause to their brand if they lose any sensitive information, or if they expose any customer information that they may have in their databases or any of the applications, right?
Yeah, I think really what we have is another example. It happens constantly to us that business is moving at a speed that is greater
Mhm.
than really GRC in this case, right? Because we're talking
Yeah,
about how do we govern them and maintain them. Typically, I found GRC to be about a year behind the ball at figuring out what's actually happening in the enterprise, and I think that's a place where it's actually pretty important is to have those standards at least yourself.
that's correct. That's correct. And if you see, um, I see, a question just pop up on how mature is the API protection market, right? I mean, this is definitely one of the big threats kind of enterprises are exposed to. I mean, if you look at some of the stats, right, 29% of the web attacks are all API related. That's an amazing stat. It just spells out how important it is to protect these APIs, especially if you are not only if you're doing north south but also east west traffic,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I suspect I don't know about a number of attacks, but number of traffic even more east west,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Especially when we look into oil and gas and electric and those kind of things. Now it's
Mhm.
now their industrial protocols aren't really considered APIs, but they still do use a lot of API traffic. Like GE's Predix is almost entirely API driven,
That's
and
correct.
that could be running a whole power plant, and right, that's
Yeah,
a lot of east west API traffic.
yeah.
I did see a stat the other day that almost 70% of the internet traffic is API related.
Wow,
Like, that's incredible, right? When you think about that, like
that's
the
crazy.
right, I figured it was TikTok. Um,
No, wow.
yeah, but the maturity of the market, to answer the question, I would say it's still fairly immature overall. It's new, right?
Mm.
It's and I wouldn't say maturity in a bad way. Maturity more in like we're toddlers in the API defense world. There's
Yes,
still a lot to be known about how to do this the right way, and how to detect them right and secure them right. So I think it's evolving today.
it is. And I think the tools that enterprises have today, let's say for example a next gen web application firewall, that really doesn't cut it for protecting against the API threats. I mean, it's primarily web-related attacks, HTTP primarily,
Mhm.
where they look at some of the north-south traffic. Talk to me a little bit about what makes WAF not good enough for protecting against API threats.
Yeah, let's just click for a minute on what a WAF's role is. Right. First of all, it's typically, as you said, north south. And the WAF's role is to stop runtime actions. So it's a little like a real firewall or a traditional, layer 4, 5, 6, 7 firewall, where it's intended to stop something that is happening right now based on a pattern or signature of attack. So for API, if I can distinguish this command or commands in this style are bad, I can block them.
Mm-hmm.
But I have no context. I have no understanding of what the API is actually doing, how it works, or where it's going. It's very different than web traffic, which we have a standard that's been in place for, gosh, I don't know, what, 35 years or something, right?
Yeah.
For HTTP, it's evolved, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, there are documents that say this is how this happens.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have that for APIs. So the WAF has to guess often, is that the right kind of command or wrong kind of command for this API? And truthfully, it has no idea because there's no context.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're using true security for APIs, there's a couple ways it happens. One is they may scan the code base of the API itself
Mm-hmm.
and look at what it's doing inside there. But again, the machine has to understand what's good and bad there.
Yeah.
Another very difficult, right? This
It
is
is.
machine learning is not magic.
It is.
And, yeah. And then the other way is to detect them in the wire, knowing that they're happening. I will detect them, identify them, classify them. And for the ones that are known, I actually know the command sets for those particular APIs. And then I can
Mhm.
program the WAF properly to stop certain types of attacks based on certain types of parameters. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's see how complicated it is suddenly if I have 15,000 APIs.
Yeah. Agree. And I mean, if I am an English speaker, I may get some context of a French speaker, somebody talking in French. I may get some understanding of what they're talking about, but I won't have a deep understanding of what exactly is being the conversation, right? I think at
Yeah.
your point, if you can't understand the protocols properly, like the REST or the JSONs that APIs use today to communicate, you can get some information, maybe not all. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Like, let's take an example just from the web application firewall side with SQL. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm going to do a SQL injection attack, um, I believe today there are about 159 rules in mod security to stop that using regex, because
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of different ways to do a SQL injection attack. But at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the day, I'm actually just doing a put. That's what I'm doing at the end, no
Yeah.
matter how I do it. And so APIs function a real similar way. Knowing this was a JSON command that came in, I don't know the context of what it means, because a lot of API commands don't say things like activate or stop or whatever. Sometimes they're symbols. Sometimes the
Mm-hmm.
actual APIs are symbols
Yeah.
because it made it less data for the device to use, right? So without a context of understanding that a ampersand dollar sign means do
Mm-hmm.
this,
Mm-hmm.
all we know is that it was told to do something.
Yeah.
Just like your example in French, right? Like I realize they're talking about going to breakfast,
Mm-hmm.
but not what they're going to have.
What they're gonna have.
Yeah. So I think that's part of the problem that's really, really difficult is, again, we don't have that standardization across the board like we have with HTTP.
Yeah. I think this is definitely a topic that is getting a lot of importance and conversations from our customers. Right. I was at an event in Toronto last week, and I spoke to a few of the CXOs that were there, and you know they don't really know what's in their environment.
Right.
They have no way to find all the APIs that are running in there. I threw the stat at them, and everybody was like shocked. Like 15,000 APIs on an average. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. With what is it, about 600 individual endpoints for those APIs?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. It's almost like what was it, about 8, 10 years ago? We figured out that IoT was going to be a problem.
Hmm.
So we started trying to discover all the devices on the network and categorize them. Well, now we just realized they all talk to stuff.
Yeah,
So we have to figure that out too.